Hello there, everyone, and welcome. It is Thursday, May 21st. It is a rainy day in Edmonton, Alberta. I am Reverend Lee Sinclair from Robertson Wesley United Church, and we are gathering for another session of sitting with the Bible and pondering how it is relevant to our lives right now. We are in the midst of the book of James and have been using both the New Revised Standard Version as well as listening to the Message, a paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. I invite you to prepare your space and yourself for this time. For myself, that means lighting my candle. I have a prayer center with symbols of my faith journey. Wherever you are, I pray that you are able to find space around you and within you to hear God today. I'm going to begin today with one of the learnings from Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg put together with his scholar friends the evolution of the word, which is actually the New Testament written with introductions to each book and letter by Marcus Borg. The difference is that this has been published in the order in which they were written, the letters and the books, according to the most current scholarship. It is a wonder to read the New Testament in a different order than normal, and sometimes allows for time frames and contexts to echo a little bit, and so we can see the differences. So, for example, in chronological order, we don't start with the Gospels. We start with the letters from Paul that we know are written authentic letters from Paul, we call them. So 1 Thessalonians and Galatians and the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter, find themselves at the beginning of a New Testament, ordered chronologically. The reason, though, that I want to quote Marcus Borg today is because he and other scholars have noted something that makes James another factor of how James is distinct. We note that James echoes more sayings of Jesus than any document in the New Testament other than the Gospels. The fiery passion of James reflects the fiery passion that James, his community, and many followers of Jesus speak of in the Gospels. We talk about the echoes of Jesus in how James responds to how we treat one another, about how we may or may not distinguish between the rich and the poor, and about how having faith, means being active. Having faith means your actions will be different, will be set apart, not as much from others as from the actions you may be tempted to take otherwise. And so we enter into our reading knowing we may listen for those echoes. We do so today in what is probably the first of a significant rainfall here in Edmonton. We've had little ones up till now. And while I've never proclaimed to be a fan of the rain that comes in May is a comfort. This is a time when both dryness and drought bring the risk of fires, the risk of not planting early enough, so many things that the rain calms, cools, and quenches. So in thanks for that first true rain of the season, I'm going to invite you to come to James chapter 2, and we are going to read the end of it today, reminding ourselves that James wrote this in reaction to some of Paul's writing. He had read and been impacted by Paul's ministry, but had been he was speaking to the community that had remained in Jerusalem, and so were mainly Christians of the Jewish tradition. They were very concerned about ethics and behavior, more than Paul, because they were united in a way with their Christian background, their Jewish background, weaving with their Jewish background. And so whenever Paul brought up something about the Jewish faith, James has some opinions about that. So starting in verse 20. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with Abraham's works, and faith was brought to completion by those works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He was called friend of God. You see, the person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, another tale from our Hebrew scriptures. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works and not by faith alone? Likewise, was not she justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. Here, James is confronting Paul on a very specific issue. As Paul did his ministry, he went into communities where there was very few Jewish people, and there were a lot of people who wanted to know about Jesus and about the new way of being community. They discovered through Paul's teaching that Jesus said we should share everything: love, food, wealth. Everything should be held in common. That we should respect the guidelines of the empire, but not believe the lies of the empire. That we must pray to idols or ensure that the rich get richer. So Paul wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they were part of this long narrative that began with Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah are the ancestors of the Jewish faith. Their story is told in Genesis, and it is one where, for Paul, it is shown that Abraham was part of God's family before he did anything. All he did was believe God existed and loved him, and that was enough for God to say, "You're in my family." James reminds us, though, that Abraham didn't say that, make a covenant with God, and then sit down. Because God isn't like that. God immediately told Abraham to get up, to go to a new place, a new land, to start a new family, a new community, a new way of being. And Abraham did. And Sarah, his wife, she said, "All right, let's do it." And so they picked themselves up and derooted themselves, displaced themselves to follow God. And in a most disturbing story, when they have children, Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his son to show how much he loves God. And Abraham goes all the way to the edge. He lights the fire. He brings his son close. That active faith and obedience is part of what makes Abraham, Sarah, and their family part of the family of God. And so, according to James, It was not just faith alone that brought people into the family of God. It was active faith. Then James reminds us of another story of someone who was marginal in her community. Rahab was a sex trade worker. We are not sure if she had done it purely because it was the only job available, or if she had somehow been coerced into this trade. But she did have her own room, her own space. And like Abraham and Sarah before her, when guests came who were in need, she said, "Come on in, eat at my table, and be safe here." Rahab hears that the town wants to arrest these messengers and hurt them, and so she helps them escape. Out another door in the town, or out a window, depending on the story you believe, she activated her faith, actively engaged with what God wanted: hospitality and safety for the oppressed. Paul is concerned that we will think we earn grace. That when God loves us, it's because we deserve to be loved. He would rather us be free to say, "I believe God loves me." And it is the moments where I trust in that feel like a free gift. And I am reminded I'm part of God's family. But James is concerned. What if people remain hidden away from the world, content to know they are loved by God without making a world of difference to anyone? Can that really be faith? James says no. James says that kind of faith is actually just dead weight. It's not doing anyone any good. And that like Rahab and Abraham, we must be active, changing our lives and other lives. Now, I am a both and person. I am someone who thinks there are times in our lives where we need to know there is nothing we can do to earn grace, but there's also nothing you can do to make God take that grace from you. There is no action or inaction that can separate you from God's love. And in that way, I am a Paul favorer. But I also know that I am very privileged. I do not need to every day see the pain that oppressive systems of racism, homophobia, sexism, and so many other ways we divide each other. Because I don't see that every single day, my faith, as much as it nourishes me, can get, well, not dead, but definitely less active, less surprising. And Jesus was someone who wanted me to be surprised. Jesus wanted me to wrestle. So I'm a both and. We need God's grace free, a gift from faith alone. And for us to truly explore, understand, and receive all the gifts that faith brings, we need to be active. Another thing that these few verses bring up for me is one of the reasons I'm not a fundamentalist when it comes to reading the Bible. Fundamentalist is a word for people who take something, it can be anything, and turn it into black and white. Even if in reality there's a lot of gray, everything is categorized. Some Christian fundamentalists believe that since the book of the Bible is our holy scriptures, every word in it is absolutely true. And I always wonder, well, then what do you do with the fact that Paul and James say something completely different? You are justified by faith alone You cannot be justified by faith alone. That is in the same book. When people say read the Bible, it will all become clear. This is one of the parts of the Bible I bring up to say does not seem clear-cut to me. It seems complex, contextual. It seems like it would take an entire community, its children and elders and everyone in the middle, wrestling with this issue to realize it's both and that each day brings a new troubling question. And so I love that my ancestors of faith said, we better keep James's letter in there. We better put it right beside Paul's. And we'll let the Christian people discern where the Spirit is in their community. The beginning of chapter 3 brings us to a metaphor. James, like many of the gospel writers, used metaphor to help explain ways for us to imagine a concept that may otherwise be invisible. In this case, the concept that is invisible is you should watch your tongue. Now, literally, unless you are taking a selfie, one cannot watch one's own tongue. But we are to guard our tongue, keep our tongue, be aware that the words we speak have impact on us, on others, on our decisions, and on others' decisions. The fun thing about this metaphor, I will talk to you about in a minute, but first let's discover what it is. So we are going to read verse 1 to 3 in chapter 3. Now, not many of you should become teachers, siblings of Christ. For you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For all of us make many mistakes, and anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can guide their whole body. It is hard to read this out loud sometimes, given that usually when I read it out loud, I am trying to teach something. But you, viewers, are teachers as well. My first pastoral charge when I was a student was a rural pastoral charge, where every single one of the children who came to church on Sunday lived on a farm. Now, they lived on different farms. Most of them were dairy, but some of them were other kinds of farms. So I had the great fun on one of my first Sundays to bring in, thanks to a friend who lent me one, a horse bridle. A horse bridle is made up of 2 to 5 pieces of metal, and then there's ropes. It's basically an entire puzzle. I had never touched one. And so I said to the children, I don't know what this is, but it has something to teach us about God. Well, of course, the children had a most marvelous time making fun of the minister who didn't even know what a bridle was or how to use one. We got out a puppet who became the horse, and they proceeded to correctly put the bridle on the horse. And that included a bit. It's literally a bit of metal that goes in the horse's mouth, and it holds their tongue down. Then we all, of course, wondered what it would be like to wear one, how uncomfortable it would be, and also the words of James. One small piece of metal in the mouth with a couple of other pieces of metal and rope mean not only can I control the head of my horse, but I can actually tell it which direction its whole body should move, how fast it should go, whether it is time to have a drink of water or keep its head up. The power of the tongue, the power of what we choose to say, has been known for generations and generations. This warning reminds us, first of all, that no one is perfect and we make many mistakes, and that we have some guidance to hold our tongue, to speak when we need to, and that will impact our community and our lives. James goes on to another metaphor in verse 4. Look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also, the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. It does boast, doesn't it? Mine does. And each of us have had times in our lives where we have spoken out of turn, hurtfully, deceitfully. If you look at the 10 commandments laid down for the Hebrew people, many of them have to do with things we would end up saying. Even using God's name in a way that would commodify God or make God small, that would limit God to one gender, one aspect of the Trinity, those are not to be used. We are also not to lie or give false witness. We are not to speak in a way that disrespects our elders, that murders or harms someone. The final commandment, the 10th, is about coveting, envying. And envy is something that often comes out in speech. Feeling resentful that we do not have something or someone that another has. The smallest guidance on our tongues can make a difference to how we act and even how we think sometimes. I want to read to you from the paraphrase, the Message. Re-listening to Bible verses in another translation or paraphrase helps us to hear the Spirit in a way that might surprise us or affirm something that we want to learn. So this is how Eugene Peterson paraphrases the beginning of chapter 3. Now, don't be in a rush to become a teacher, my friends. Teaching, it's highly responsible work, and teachers are held to the strictest standards. None of us are perfectly qualified. We get it wrong nearly every time we open our mouths. If you could find someone whose speech was perfectly true, well, then you'd have a perfect person in perfect control of life. A bit in the mouth of a horse controls the whole horse. A small rudder on a huge ship in the hands of a skilled captain sets the course in the face of the strongest winds. A word out of your mouth may seem of no account, but it can accomplish almost anything or destroy it. James takes time to talk about active faith. One of the reasons for that is because James came from ancestry of a Jewish faith where living in community meant the difference between life and death. James was also a follower of Jesus. Jesus, who said, "It is how we treat the neighbor that matters to God." How much we love our neighbor and our God are connected. So how you treat one another matters, and how you live in community matters. And James begins with our tongues. This active faith we are called to. It begins with a simple thing, seemingly. But how powerful is our tongue? We have been engaging for many years at Robertson Wesley in affirming ministries. Affirming ministries are the types of ministries that help educate, minister to all people, and in particular cry out for where people are being marginalized for being who they are. It began in, I believe, the 80s, perhaps as early as the 70s, as a united church movement that said our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, well, it has expanded. We have learned so much as a denomination and as a congregation, how much our language limits our imagination in places where God has never placed limits. That there are not two genders, that there are not two sexual orientations, that there are no two people perfectly alike in gender identity or sexual orientation, in how they present themselves, how they speak of themselves, and how they hope we will speak with them. The reason I bring this up with James, well, pronouns. Pronouns are some of the tiniest words in the English language, and in most languages. Most languages, they are made up of maybe 2, maybe 3, sometimes 4 letters. Small little words. I grew up as a small child, sometimes being mispronounced, meaning someone would mistake me for someone identifying as a man or male child, and I would get he'd. Sometimes I didn't notice, but most often I did. I can't say it was hurtful all the time, because when I was very little, I didn't understand how they could get it wrong or what it was that made me feel uncomfortable with it, because really, it wasn't bad to be a he. I just knew it wasn't me. I do remember one time when it made me cry, and I pull that memory up a lot. I don't have ill will, and I don't even remember who it was, but I remember where I was, because I was so surprised that I could cry over someone who wasn't calling me a name or even calling me my wrong name. It was just a pronoun. But I remember that because it stopped happening after puberty for me. I happened to be one of those people for whom my gender identity and my biology match for the most part. So, but for some people, that experience, that pinprick or full-on assault of being mispronounced is an absolutely everyday account. And that's really hard. Well, actually, it's more than hard. And I don't know what good words to use for it because it's not been my experience. And I hope you have time to look at our affirming videos with Shiloh and others teaching us some of this. I do know it's very difficult for me to change pronouns in my head and in my speaking. If I find out I have mispronounced someone and they are graceful enough to tell me, I apologize and I strive. I strive hard to properly use their true names and their true pronouns. And I misstep a lot. and grace abounds, but so does pain. I know that James, the writer of the letter of James, didn't know. He was talking about something that would relate to gender identity or sexual orientation or anything like that when he spoke about the importance of language. He did not have those concepts in his mind because of his worldview and his time and place. People around him probably did. But when he spoke, he did know a piece of wisdom, that to be faithful to Jesus means being called to be faithful to the truth and to community. And often, if we want our faith to be alive and active, that means learning. Learning what our tongue does, the power it holds to hurt, but also to work wonders. To cry out true names at the top of our lungs, to express love to community and friends. Luckily, James does not say this is supposed to be easy. Paul doesn't either. They both agree faith, work, following Jesus, very difficult, will not be done perfectly by anyone. However, to try is faithful. To have faith means actively trying. And they've gifted us with some wonderful metaphors for how that might work. What would it mean for me to hold my tongue to the bottom of my mouth and not speak? What would it mean when an inappropriate or harmful joke goes by to pick up my tongue, to speak into the community and say, hey, that is not how we speak to one another with love. Now, for those of you who want to use the sailor image, that's wonderful too. Because boy, those rudders on those ships truly are little things. And sailors know how to help the boat go in the right direction by the use of just that rudder. And so I invite you to go into your week and your weekend speaking and holding silence, knowing that your faith and your words and your actions are all braided together. What would you like to try and not say this weekend? Or is there someone you want to call and say, hi, I think I've been mispronouncing you, or using a name that is no longer you. So I want to apologize, but I need to learn. How do I address you so that I can celebrate who you are? However you speak up or stay silent in the coming days, know that God is with you, loving you and striving with you to make your world and God's world one of love, one of peace, one of health, with occasions for great joy. Blessed be. I will see you next week, and we will spend another couple of days with James. Thanks again, and God's blessings be upon you.